So, a few weeks back, I find myself on a lazy Sunday saying to my girlfriend, get your coat, because we have to get in the car. Because we're going to a coffee shop, and we're going to find out if everybody on the internet is either lying, or that I made a huge mistake. And either way, it will be fun. Now, to backtrack a little bit on that decision, I was reading a lot about making espresso on the internet. And a lot of people on forums and sites like Reddit describe their espresso shots as tasting like strawberry, pomegranate, raspberry, raisin, grapefruit, almond, those kind of tastes, where my espresso shots tasted like cardboard, rubber, skunk, mold, petroleum, and had a sort of general Band-Aid-like texture and taste. Now you can obviously see the difference. So, not so long ago, or a couple of years actually, I bought an espresso machine, and at that time I didn't do that much research into it. Didn't have that much money, so I ended up on what is generally known as sort of the deux chevaux of espresso machines, easy to maintain, this quick mill baby over here. Settled on Italian-style roast, because, well, that's what most espresso people drink, and quickly let go of investigating. However, I think I got a few bad bags or something like that, but anyway, my espresso started tasting less and less. It got the general cardboard, skunk, Band-Aid-like like taste that I talked about earlier. So naturally, I blamed the machine because hey, it gets the most prominent place in making espresso. And that's also good because if the machine is broken, well, hey, you can buy this one, right? And what's not to like? So I immediately liked my own reasoning and sort of fell in love with my own conclusion and started searching on the internet about machines that would fit my budget and my kitchen space. And as I delved deeper and deeper into this cult of people making espresso, I found people who were actually debugging and sort of deconstructing their espresso shots. And if you search on YouTube and those kind of sites, you will find lots of people filming their espresso shots like this. They have these open filters, and you can see sort of every mistake that you make with it. And they are also the ones who were describing their espresso shots as tasting like strawberry and raisins and all those nice flavors, rather than the gunk and Band-Aid that I got. And they united under the hash flag, I would say, beans over machines. Which is interesting, because if you look at espresso setups, the machine is what takes all the glory, right? It has this big prominent place, and the beans are usually over somewhere on the side. It's the machine that gets all the glory. Which led me to the question that I tried to answer on that particular Sunday. Right? Is the blueberry bomb, as it's described often, really this big conspiracy, or am I missing something? Did I jump to a conclusion too soon? And basically, the question that I was asking myself: what is good coffee? And in part, that's subjective, right? But it also has a deductive component. You have these flavor wheels that people use to describe their coffees, right? Mine fell in this area: chemical and general, paper and musty flavor, things like petroleum and medicinal and all those things you want to avoid. And I think, looking back, it slowly dawned on me that I was at that time at the height of Mount Stupid in the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, for those of you who don't know Dunning-Kruger, that is a cognitive bias where people sort of are overly comfortable, have overvalued confidence based on their lack of knowledge. So basically, you know so little about a subject that you're incapable of seeing what you don't know. And the danger is that you feel super confident about it, because how hard can it be? And as I sort of slid off Mount Stupid back into the valley of despair, I had to look for somebody who with actual knowledge to see if I could validate whether it was an actual lie or that I was missing something. So all of a sudden, I found myself on another graph, which happens to be the graph that we also use in our work to judge the question, is this a good API? I had to go back sort of from where I thought I was, nice and stable, to the research phase, or the more chaotic phase, where I had to admit that I didn't know anything that I was talking about. And as I said, this happens to be also the graph that we use at work to show people, or to help people, help teams in their question, is this a good API? Now, we already got a little bit of introduction, but my name is Ernst, this is Flavia, and we work for ING Bank, and we work in a team that's primarily concerned with API design and governance. And ING is a bank. It's actually quite a large bank. And we work with many different teams from many different departments, and they come to us with our APIs. They come from the mortgage department, from the savings department, from the lending department, the security accounting department, you name it. And they basically all have the same question. If you sort of distill all the noise, they are asking us, is this a good API? And, well, yeah.
Yes, no, maybe. I think those are the general answers we give to this question, is this a good API? And although our answers haven't changed that much over the past years, the way we evaluate the question has certainly changed. And it is this shift in our evaluation is what we'd like to talk to you about today. So the question still is this a good API? And to talk you through the shift, I'd like to take you at the inception of our API journey so that you'll understand the starting point we made at ING. So this was the year 2013. I had just joined ING, and within a week of joining, we had this first API community meeting, which my manager had arranged. And he got his buddy managers in the room, some tech people, some architects, and hooray, we have this first API community meeting. Now this meeting starts off. My manager, he enthusiastically talks to people about how great APIs are and how we should all be making them at ING. And great, there was good energy, and suddenly I saw over a period of time, 15 minutes or so, the feeling in the room was changing from enthusiasm to skepticism to cynicism. Because the architects in the room and the engineers said, we already have a service-oriented architecture, we have web services, we have decoupled a lot of components, so why move over to another architecture which basically does the same thing? So why change? And at that moment, I thought that this is not only the first API community meeting, it probably might just be the last API community meeting I'll attend. And when I was sitting there, first week of my job, and I'd been doing APIs for some time now, and I said, I have to say something, because if I don't speak up why APIs are different than web services, I think we are never going to embrace it within this company. So I gathered all the courage I had at that point, and I said to the room, APIs are different than web services. And then somebody said, why? How? And with all courage, I gathered to mutter a couple of words. I said, APIs are different than web services because APIs are designed outside in. And the whole room went silent. Probably it was just me, but it felt like ages for words to come back in that room. And then somebody said, what's outside in? And this was a question I'd prepared for a long time in my life already, and I had this answer all cooked up. said APIs that are designed outside in are designed from the perspective of the user who is going to use the APIs, instead of our own perspective. Because in my experience, web services, which I had dealt with, were designed from the perspective of what we know best, or perspective of our own systems. And this took somehow that meeting on a very different trail. People were getting enthusiastic again, and I soon found myself explaining customer journeys and all kinds of design artifacts which can help to design these APIs outside in. And then somebody in the room said, customer journeys. Oh, I know this artifact. I've heard about it before. Remember, this is a tech group. So no one had heard about an artifact like customer journeys then. But one guy had, and he said, that we make these things at ING. And I said, can I see them? Because apparently we have this artifact, which we can use to design our APIs, but we at Tech never get to see this artifact. And somehow in that moment, it clicked to this guy who happened to be, who is now the CIO, that a business artifact or an artifact which is created in the business side of the company can be so crucial in creating something which is a technical artifact. So somehow he saw that APIs are not just a technical artifact, but something more than that. And like I said, it was not the last API community meeting. Luckily, we had a second one, and where I talked about how wonderful REST is and how the style of REST described the fielding constraints and so on. And people got more excited. Now, third meeting, I was seeing you counting the bunnies. Third meeting, I talked about hypermedia and how it was great to not make it optional for our APIs, to talk about how a state transfer is equally important to just giving back state. And there was a lot of enthusiasm and discussion around this topic. And basically what I'm trying to say is that we were making APIs then. There was no longer this whole resistance to creating APIs. I think people bought the idea that these are different artifacts and we should invest in them. And so we had our two starting points at this time, right? REST, we had REST, and we had outside in. We hadn't defined them properly, but that wouldn't stop people from creating APIs. And we got a lot of APIs, just like these wonderful tulips in all kinds of colors and forms sprouting from the ground, because it was really cool to make one. And the developers, they loved creating and showing off their APIs. So our API community meetings happened where people came on stage and showcased what they had made. And soon we ran into a different kind of problem. So we no longer had the problem of convincing people to make APIs, but how do you put all these wonderful tulip and make a vase out of it, right? So how do you bundle them? How do you talk about whether this API is better or good or not good? How do you evaluate such a landscape? So what we also saw is that we are missing something very crucial, is that we don't know how to find our APIs. We don't have a place where we can store them, where others can see. So we're missing critical components in our infrastructure. And that's where we realized, OK, we need to have an API directory on a portal, a developer portal. So these concepts started coming up because people were creating more and more APIs. And at this time, I found myself as a product owner of a team, which is very dear to me even now. It's called Team Origins. And this team created the developer portal for ING. And we called it Lonely Planet, because it felt a bit like a city you have never been, the API city, and this product could help you navigate through that city to show you what APIs we have already built. And I think it was a great opportunity to think about product ownership and to talk to business stakeholders and make them enthusiastic about APIs. And because we were the guardians of this portal, it was one portal for all APIs. soon we saw that every API was passing through us, right? So we got a lot of emails saying, is this a good API? So I said, am I the person who is supposed to make this decision? And apparently, yes, people were asking us for stamps, people were asking us, how do we comply? And at this time, we were not sure what kind of stamps we want to give, how do we want to set up compliance, what makes a good API. But suddenly, we were forced into, in a very good way, into something which we now proudly call ourselves as the stamping department, a stamping department for APIs. And you can imagine, to reiterate, these people were coming from all parts of the company. There were mortgages, there were securities, there was lending, trade, finance. We hardly knew anything about those domains, and yet we had to make this very hard decision. And again, our answers to those questions are yes, no, maybe. But we had to get better in asking the right questions to these people. And what we did is essentially, we started with our two first starting points, right? We had REST, we had outside in. And we soon realized that REST, just saying that you have to make an API, which is REST, is not enough. The fielding constraints are not enough, because you can create different kinds of APIs abiding to the same constraints. I know it feels very obvious now that you should have guidelines around how you structure your URLs, how you structure your input, your output, the JSON. And we realized that to help people understand REST, we had to write guidelines. So we wrote them. So all these questions about how do we do REST at this company somehow disappeared because we had guidelines in place. But more questions popped up. Say, OK, we read your guidelines, but how do we do, for instance, how do we encrypt stuff? We have certain security standards which we need to follow. Your guidelines don't help us do that, for instance. And this is how we started discovering patterns based on our guidelines. So things like the me pattern, saying that you can put a /me in the URL and say that you are the user, and then you don't have to give your identification, your bank account numbers, or your BSN, or your social security numbers to identify you. And this is something we discovered as we saw more and more APIs which were coming along. Also things like post to get is a pattern which we now very frequently use, and now we can just say, you need to do the post to get pattern. But at that time, we had to see, OK, it doesn't, what you're trying to deal here is not a get request. So you have to post to get the data. So this is a pattern we discovered as well. Some other stuff, the Cqrs pattern is something we stumbled upon with one of our APIs, where we had to separate the get and the post request, and how do you deal with something like this? So patterns really helped form the base above the guidelines to help teams answer the REST question. What we also used, we saw that teams were still not using the full glory of REST. So we started using the Richardson's maturity model to help teams, to nudge teams to shift their APIs up on this graph. So we saw teams reasonably making level 1, level 2 APIs, and very, very few attempting level 3, because that's a hard level. So we encourage teams to say, hey, 2 teams have reached level 3, when would you? Right? Something like that. So it was a very healthy way of comparing the maturity of your API just by showing teams this model. And level 3 APIs are really great, right? So this could be a level 3 API where you have a shopping basket with no items in the basket. You don't get any actions back. And the moment you add an item to your basket, you probably start getting hints to what you can do next. These are great APIs to consume. But to design them and to nudge teams to design them is a big effort, because teams need to start understanding how to navigate through their process domain. So good, we guidelines, patterns, Richardson's maturity model. Somehow, all questions regarding how REST and what is REST was kind of disappearing by now. And we started mingling ourselves or discussing a lot of implementation details. So teams came to us with, is this a good API? And they said, we have the best tech to implement our API. We are doing it with Scala or Cassandra, or even that I'm just a backend team. I just have this database and this is my API. So all those kind of things, and started to think to ourselves, this is not a good discussion to have. When you want to discuss API, you should discuss only the interface, and you should separate the implementation. Implementation is a great discussion to have on its own, but we felt that mingling those two discussions were not helping us answer the question correctly or evaluate an API correctly. So this is where we made, I think, a big pivot to how our developer portal looked like. Because up until now, our portal was just accepting an API as a name, a description, and some link to a documentation page. And now we said, OK, we need to have a discussion on the interface. And this is where we shifted to from this free format form to Swagger, or Open API specification file. We said we have to force teams to upload their interface so that we can have a discussion on their interface file. And this was a big movement because there was a lot of pushback on this. He said, you're suddenly increasing the bar on your portal. So we had a lot of teams who didn't have this file, so we had to encourage them to make this one. But soon, when this change was made, we saw that at least those implementation questions went away. They were put for, they were almost pushed behind. So we first had a discussion on how your interface was designed and shaped. And then we could have on how you're going to implement it. So I think it was a great, great insight and a great step. I'll not spoil the whole talk, but this decision is biting us today. But we'll tell you why it is biting us. But at that time, it seemed like a good thing to go for contract-first design.
So, to give you a bit of a recap, in our company, or at this point in time, we have a developer portal based on Open API specification, lots of design guidelines, the patterns that we showed you, API meta model, all sorts of documentation defining terms and things like that. And what's really interesting is that if you start to shift the API catalog that you have away from implementation and sort of unstructured documentation towards Open API specifications or the like, you start to see patterns in design as well. Because you can design a single API or an API in very different ways. And by observing what people were doing and sort of reasoning about it and trying to extract a higher level out of all these interfaces that we saw, we needed to give names and terms to what people were doing. So we came up with 3 design perspectives, called the self, the screen, and the stage. And self is what we encourage people to avoid. But unfortunately, if you don't make a conscious decision of what kind of API you want to be or what design perspective you want to choose, a lot of people accidentally end up designing an API from the self perspective. I'll give you an example later. Because the self perspective is very easy. Right? You just implement what you already know. You have a database and it has fields, and you just copy those fields to your API resources. And the API follows very narrowly the backend structure. And you end up with APIs that give out status code 5, which is something, but it means something if you're intimately familiar with the backend system. I think screen, you can all imagine, those are APIs that follow a specific mobile app or maybe a web app, stuff like that. And stage is where we encourage teams to create APIs basically that let go of their own ego. sort of become a stage where others can build services on top, regardless of whether they want to do it in one step or 5 screens or as many screens or steps as you want to be. So now these self APIs, they are typically very CRUD-like, and they reflect steps that sort of mimic the business process. This, for instance, is an example of a credit card request API, and it has a number of steps, which you can see. You have to check some income, assert some risk, issue the card, send a letter, all those kind of steps that are reflected in this business process. And APIs that are designed from this perspective are really hard to reuse, because you're distributing your business processes across applications, across mobile applications. So whenever you want to change something, you're now dealing with this situation that parts of your logic are implemented over there and parts are implemented over there, and you've lost control, basically. But if you don't make a conscious decision on where on this continuum you want to be, you'll end up quickly here. So instead of mimicking the business processes, we encourage teams to see if they can utilize, for instance, the patch function. So again, the same credit card request API. It starts by creating an empty request, sort of like an empty form, if you will, and then over time, in as many operations as you want, you can patch in details, patch in an address block, patch in the amount of the limit on the credit card, for instance. And once you're done patching in, either in one go or in five steps, you do a post to that identifier, signaling so the default action on that form, which in this case is submit, process it to the next step. If there are others, you can have action resources and things like that. But this way, we try to nudge teams to think about batching calls and stuff like that. And it's important to remember that up until now, most of our APIs were created for internal use or mobile applications and such like that, and things like that. And then, and this may sound funny, then the best thing that could ever happen to a bank occurred, which is regulation. Namely PSD2 regulation. And the PSD2, which is European regulation, forces all 7,000-ish financial institutions in the European Union or region to open up. They have to provide 3 APIs, mandatory. One is to check the availability of funds. So do you have more than 700 euros or whatever? One is to initiate a payment. So I want to transfer money. And the third one is sort of your account history. Basically, you download your previous transactions. And those 3 APIs are mandatory for all financial institutions, including ING. And that means that finally, we're opening up. Because this is what we've been pushing for so long. We saw all these product opportunities, but nobody wanted to be the first. Nobody wanted to invest in the infrastructure, the security, the legal route, all the things that you have to do for public APIs, especially in a company as big as ING. So all of a sudden, APIs were sort of the big hype. Everybody wanted to know what this PSD2 and what does an API mean? What does it do? Is it going to put us out of business if we're giving away our data for basically for free? So we've been giving a lot of API thinking trainings and sort of demystifying APIs for people who consider themselves non-engineers. And all of a sudden, we saw a great influx of people from all over the company signing up and wanting to know basically what an API is. And we've been pushing and nudging people to think about APIs not only as a technical artifact, but also as a business opportunity. So the two of them sort of magically aligned, and we finally had a broader audience to preach the statement that API design should not be only left to techies, but that you need more people to create these APIs. We had 2 strategies based on, I would say, inspiration and perspiration, where sort of the proverbial carrot and stick, if you will. Where the inspiration is about letting the business understand the technology and the business out of API and sort of merging them together using design thinking. And I would say this is roughly 1% of our success. And we go about in these trainings, in our API thinking trainings, by giving them a lot of examples and things that we observe in the world around us. And because if you want to talk to business about APIs, you have to talk the business language. You have to talk about how you make money with these things. And it matters for you as an engineer and for us as engineers, because we have an engineering background as well, that it matters for which kind of company you work, that you understand the business model, the incentive, the ethics that go into how you make money. So we talk a lot about, for instance, brand atomization, which is a term coined by Fjord. I know probably you remember this little machine. And there's an interesting sort of shift in technology that's been going on. Whereas in the early days, you as a user had to intimately know the machine. And I think this is a nice example, because if you want to get the floppy disk out, you have to drag the floppy disk icon on the desktop to the trash can. And it ejects your floppy disk. It doesn't erase your files, but that's sort of the way these machines work. And over time, with devices like this and devices like the Gillette or the Amazon Dash button, what we're seeing is that technology is adapting to us as users rather than that we have to adapt to the machines. And this little gizmo here is an interesting little product by Amazon. And the idea being is that you place them in your house wherever you need them. And whenever you run out of something, you just push a button. The thing is connected to the internet, and it places an order for whatever is on the display on your Amazon shopping basket. And it does so using APIs. So you can see that using APIs, you can plug your brand, your services into all these platforms, basically creating a situation where your APIs and your products and your services through APIs are relevant in a place and a time where your customers are. Because it turns out that not every one of our customers is spending their entire day on our website, which is crazy, but hey. Spotify, by the way, is an example of a company that does that really well. They let go of the way their app looks and behaves, and by doing that, a lot of companies are able to integrate their products and services into their own, such as Volvo or Waze, navigation app, things like that. So we tell people, basically, that an API is your brand atom. It is your smallest shippable unit that you use to plug into all these platforms to deliver your services, again, in a place and time that is relevant for your customers. Another trend that we talk about, and this is probably very near and dear to all of you, is that a lot of companies are trying to become programmable something, right? So programmable insurance, for instance, or programmable lending, or programmable whatever. And you can do that as well with the services that you've been already making for all these years. And wouldn't that be great? And lastly, we talk about basically the internet and how globalization, or how the internet set the distribution cost of your service to zero. And that means that you can compete on a global market. And by having a distribution cost which is zero, you can sort of justify the time and the investment to make niche products, where you used to have these really generic, big SAP, Oracle-like implementation that you brought on site and then spent millions and millions customizing them. Now you can offer niche products which are deeply optimized and target specific small groups. And you can do so because of the internet, because you can compete globally. And that means that you can invest in experiences. Coming back to my coffee example, this is a model put forward by Joe Pine, an economist, a couple of years back. And he created 4 categories of value. Basically, what are people willing to pay for something? He defined commodities, goods, services, and experiences over here. And he said experiences is what people are willing to pay the most for because they're personal. So if we can somehow turn our products and our services into experiences, we're entering a whole new market. And I think this largely explains graphs like this, the fintech scene, right? Where we have these niche players that solve a very narrow slither, but do it really well. And that's interesting because we can compete and partner with these companies as well. And if we can make APIs and sort of bring those two worlds together, then I think you have a very powerful opportunity. But the thing with APIs is that you really have to understand why your API is here. Why are you making this thing? Is it to drive innovation? Is it a product? Is it for device and mobile support? And the better you're able to answer that question, then the better you're able to answer the question, is this a good API?
The why question. Why question is really, really hard. That counts for most of the why questions, but why is your API here is a very difficult question to answer. And it's somehow, what we have seen is that it is always almost left unanswered because people assume that others know why the API is here. People don't dare to check. And within all these assumptions and handovers and awkward movements that happen with API design, somehow the reason or the reason why your API is here gets lost or doesn't get communicated to the people building them. And you're talking about two groups of people here. You have the business on one side, who thinks that IT is the cost center, and you have developers at one side who think their skills are transferable and it doesn't matter where I work because I don't need to understand the business. So how do you bring these two groups together? Because you need them. You need both of these groups together to answer the why question. It's not only enough that the business understands why the API is here, but the developers have to, together with the business, shape this question. I don't know if you have tried this as an experiment, to put business and IT people in a room and just close the room and give them this question and say, answer it? Won't happen. Won't happen. Even if you give the question, why is your API here, you will not get a concrete answer, or you don't get an agreed answer. So we realized that this question is incredibly important to answer because we want to understand if it's a good API or not, but we have to somehow find a way for these two groups to mingle to answer this question. So here are our first steps, which we are trying out with teams to help them navigate this incredibly hard question. So we asked the teams, business and IT, to formulate their design challenge. Design challenge is a very well-known artifact within the design thinking community, and it sets out to answer these 4 questions. What problem are you solving? What's the ultimate impact you want to achieve? The possible solutions you see, and the context and the constraints which are associated with it. And this is a way of getting to the why question. Right? So, and when you have a discussion within your group, all your hidden assumptions and your language comes to float. And we have seen teams struggle a lot with formulating a design challenge, but when you do that more and more, you understand how that goes. Another thing which we are encouraging teams to spend time on is the business model canvas. A very well-known artifact within the business realm, not that much in the IT realm, but basically allows you to focus on what is your value proposition and your revenue streams. And I think it's incredibly important to understand that, both for business and IT. So these are the 2 first steps we took to ask teams to spend time on. We are looking at a more comprehensive deck in the future, which we want to ask teams, a start deck, if you may, which has more questions like, is your API cohesive? Or what principles and values are you trying to codify? And how are you going to monetize your API? And when you look at each of these questions, you are forced to mingle. So you're forced to answer these together, business and IT. Or at least that is our hope. Cohesive. This looks like a horrible flower, right? An API which is cohesive has a nice balance, which has post a request, but also ways to get it. So see if your API is cohesive. Things like which principles you're codifying. The GDPR is a great one to think about what does privacy mean to our company, what does privacy mean to our API? How are we going to set out with these kind of data? Monetization, again, an incredibly difficult question to ask the tech community. For business, this goes okay because they understand this terminology, but we think that technology people also have to understand how monetization works and how are we going to make money with this API. And we encourage teams not to hide behind the internal usage one, which is a nice one to hide behind. So basically, what we have come down to, and at this moment I can say the very least that the API design for us starts with answering that why question. So why is your API here? And if you can't answer that question, we are in no way, we can make a decision whether it's a good API or not. And the fluency you can answer that question gives us confidence to make that decision. And we see teams going through that squiggle again, right? So because it's a hard question, the answers are not known directly. So you have to, what we try to tell the teams is that it is okay to be there. It's okay to feel uncomfortable because you're talking to new people, talking different languages. And over a period of time, it will stabilize. Your design will stabilize, and the product you're making as well. So.
I think this is a nice segue because this is also exactly where I found myself on that coffee journey. Only you have to realize exactly where you're in, know that it will be that it will be okay. And this is indeed what this graph signals. Hopefully, your projects and your research starts over there, because I've been also in projects that started over there, and then gradually over time ended up here, and that's terrible. So yeah, there you have it. This is our current stamping team. The people behind the question, is this a good API? And our answers will still be yes, no, maybe. But hopefully we've been able to show you that the type of questions that we ask you to answer this question have changed over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Fantastic, terrific. There are several questions, and cool. Yep, I think we can just dive right into the first few.
Okay.
Are the API guides and patterns available outside of your bank?
Some of them are. I think we wrote a couple of blog posts and some articles, especially on the design perspectives. Hopefully, we'll be able to publish more of them.
Okay. What is stopping the bank from making these APIs publicly available? Aren't you obliged to make them public due to PSD2 regulations?
Yeah, we have to make them public. They will be public, but you have to understand that ING and especially the units that are affected by PSD2 are 11 countries, and we chose to provide one API for all 11 countries rather than 11 APIs.
Right.
So that meant that we had to align internally as well, and that takes time.
Right. Just a lot more business units, a lot more meetings.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So how do you orchestrate your API calls?
So we have a lot of service discovery in place. Again, if you upload your specification to our developer portal, then you're also automatically enlisted in the service discovery. And we have things like peer-to-peer encryption and things like that.
And I assume you'll understand this question.
Yeah.
What is your position on the Berlin group solution, and do you need a lot of changes to comply?
So I think here it's referred to here as the Berlin group proposal for PSD2. Which you have to understand. So so there are 7,000 institutions in the financial region that are affected by PSD2. Are they all going to make their own API? that could happen. So a number of groups sort of stood up and said, these are proposals, open source API specification. One of them is the Berlin group. We've adapted the Berlin group as well.
Okay. So you're ready to go if
Yeah.
it comes down to that.
Yeah. We had to make some changes, but not so much, because the standard allows it's pretty flexible.
Okay. I don't want to take the B word into my mouth. Is that a sensible question to ask you?
The difference between API and public blockchains. Let's do that over beer.
Right, okay. So can we find your slides somewhere?
Yeah, they will be available on SlideShare.
Terrific. Can you, let's see, last question, I think, if it comes down to me. Can you expand on the patterns that you were talking about before, like post to get, and that I also found that a very interesting slide.
Yeah. So the typical query to use in REST to fetch data is get. But we see that there is some data we can't put in the query parameters because of security reasons. So we need to post the data to get the data. And it happens a lot when you're dealing with IBAN numbers or privacy-sensitive data. So you don't want them to enter into server logs and things like that. So you can't have them in the URL. So we recognize that this is a commonly occurring theme, and we needed to find a way to deal with it. And the way we dealt with it is saying, OK, make it as a post request, where you post your data, which is sensitive, to get information. So yes, that's deviating from REST.
Right.
But because it's a pattern we have seen so many places, and we have documented it, we can have a discussion that this is OK to do. So we needed to build upon the guidelines in that way. So,
OK.
If I may add one thing to that. So our URLs sort of have a naming conventions where you can see, oh, this is supposed to get.
Mm-hmm. OK. Does anybody want to hear about a couple of the other patterns that were on that slide before? Yes. Can you open up that slide?
Oh, dear.
And we can play, bingo.
So whack them all.
we have to defend our pattern.
Can you switch to the slides, please, Christian?
Where is it? Well, we all know it was in here somewhere.
It was further up. Up.
Up. There you go.
Right. Somebody shout out something that looks weird and interesting. Go. What's that? CQRS.
CQRS. So yes, basically CQRS is separating the reads from the writes. So a lot of the time we have teams that say you want to, I don't know, process a payment, for instance. And processing payments we've been doing that for 20 or 30 years using HP nonstop. And there's a dedicated team that maintains those servers and those instances. And but you also want to, I don't know, have a listing of the payments that are waiting order approval, for instance, or you want to see your previous transactions. So the reality is that in large companies, and also for deployment reasons, it's not the same team that is maintaining both endpoints, if you will, or both sides of the APIs. So Cqrs is a pattern that allows you to separate queries from writes. And as a way of sort of, it's still, in the end, is one elegant API, but internally we can handle them differently.
Interesting. Anything else? Anyone want to pick another one? Okay, you and then I'll get to you. What are the canaries?
Canary releases. So this is a bit combined with feature toggles. The canary releases are basically if you want to update a service, if you want to update an API, but you want to see how it behaves in the field first. So you put it out, and this is where also service discovery comes in. Using our service discovery mechanism, you can say stream 1% or 2% or a specific portion of your traffic to a specific endpoint so that we can test it. And it's a reference to the old coal mines where they carried the canary in a box. If there wasn't enough oxygen, the canary would die.
Right.
So we use that same mechanism to test software.
Okay, so 2% of the users get the thing that might or might not work.
That might or might not work.
And if it doesn't work, then...
Yeah, too bad. 98% are happy.
Yes. So how do you deal with
long-running transactions?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the asynchronous behavior. So a lot of time when we have asynchronous workflows, we give back a URL where you can check the status. So for instance, the credit card request form that I showed you earlier, that you can sort of partially fill with those patches and then submit. You would get back a UID or some GUID or something like that, where you can check the status. So it's the responsibility of the client to fetch that URL. Sometimes we also use callback mechanisms, so you provide a callback URL. That's a little bit more difficult because a lot of the time the infrastructure doesn't allow calls to the outside world due to all sorts of security restrictions and stuff like that.
All right. Thank you really very, very much. It was incredibly interesting. Thanks, everyone.
Cool.